Hello over there again. Welcome back again to the next video on Spring Boot playlist. And in this particular video, we are going to explain how to implement the Spring Data JPA repository and how to be able now to persist the entity that we have created in the previous lesson, and how to be able to use some of the methods and functions provided by the Spring JPA repository in order to persist our entities in our database. So without wasting of time, I normally like going to recap what we covered just in the previous lesson, in case you have just attended this lesson, so that you can be able that there is some prerequisite that we've done and you should be able to understand that too. So in the previous lesson, we were on implementing this the persistence layer and the model layer. So we have created the student entity with these property fields, and now we want to move and create the JPA repository, which will now be able to help us to persist this entity that we have created. So when you go back to our code that we have created, this is the entity, the student entity which we have created, and this is the field or the columns that our student table will be able to have. So in this particular video right now, when you run this application, then this application is going to run and create this entity, because you have annotated it with entity annotation, and because you have the dependency for JPA, and then JPA is going to use this annotation to create a table called student, and this table will have these columns. But up to now, you cannot be able to persist this entity. You cannot be able to perform any CRUD operation on this entity until you are able to create a JPA repository, an interface which will implement this JPA repository. And this JPA repository is the one that will enable you to persist your entity and be able to perform all the CRUD operations. So as you can see here, we have one table which has been created. You can see the SQL statement which has been printed here. So we have this table created with these columns, and the first column is actually the date of birth. We have the first name, the last name, the registration number, and the surname. So now up to this point, sorry about my... So up to this point, you have no way of interacting or manipulating this entity. For us to be able to persist this entity, then we need to create a repository which will be able to persist this. So to create that, I am also going to have to create a different package, and this package, I'm going to call it repository. I'm going to call it the repository, or simply repo, or you can call it any name, but it is good to give it the convenient name which will enable you and another person to know what kind of file is in this folder. So I'm going to use this particular folder to keep all my repositories. So in this folder, I'm going to create the first repository, which is, I'm going to call it the student repository. I'm going to call it the student repository. And this student repository is the one that is going to persist this student table. And because it is going to be repository, I need to add another annotation called at repository. At repository, and this annotation will make this specific class. In fact, it is not going to be a class, but rather an interface. So this is an interface which we have declared here, and this interface is what is going to persist this table or persist this entity called the student. This annotation called at repository is going to make this entity to be available so that we can be able to inject it in our service later when we need to use this repository. And because we said that this is the repository, it must be able to extend the JPA repository, which is provided by the JPA library itself. So here, for us to be able now to persist, we need to extend the JPA repository. And this JPA repository is the repository which is provided by the JPA module. And then here we are going to specify now which kind of entity, which of this entity we are going to persist. So we are going to persist the student. We specify the entity that we want to persist, and then also let us import this class. So we are specifying that we are going to persist this object, and then we also need to specify the primary key, the type, the data type of the primary key of this entity. So when you come to the student table, our primary key is ID and the type of it is long. So we need to specify that data type, that it is of long data type. So with this implementation, then we are able now to use this JPA repository, and we are able to use some of the methods provided by it in order to persist and perform all the CRUD operations on this particular entity. When you go to this JPA repository, you can see that it is the implementation which is provided by the JPA, and it has some default methods which it gives us, such as to save a user, maybe to save the entity, to delete an entity, to update an entity, to get an entity by ID, to find all the entities and all that. So with these basic methods, we can be able now to use these methods to perform the CRUD operation and persist this entity in our database. All right. So now this is simply how you create your database, how you create your JPA repository, I mean. Now, if you want, for example, if you come to this JPA class and it has some of these basic methods, if you find that maybe you don't have, there's no method which is satisfying your need, you can as well define some of the methods here. This is what we call the custom methods. So you can define your custom methods here, and these custom methods, you define how you're going to manipulate. But these are the basic methods provided by the Spring JPA repository, and this is how we implement the JPA to tell the JPA which entity do we want to persist, and then from here we can now be able to use it to persist that entity in our database. Otherwise, thanks, and that is how we simply implement the JPA repository. And now in the next video, we will now implement the next layer, which is the service layer, and then we will implement the method to add the student. And then we will now come here in the controller and create an endpoint, which will now, when we call that endpoint with the student data, that endpoint will take that data and call the service layer method. And this service layer method is going to use the JPA repository to add this data to the database. So that is how it works. That is how these layers depend on each other. Otherwise, I hope you really find this content useful to your needs. And if you have any queries, you can type them in form of a comment. And also, if you like the content, please consider subscribing to get the latest content, and also sharing it with a friend who might be interested. Otherwise, thanks for watching this particular content on implementation of JPA repository. And then we are going to have a look more into the JPA in the subsequent lesson, so that we can look in more details how maybe we can define the custom methods, how do we add our own methods in this JPA repository interface class, and how to add more of the to use more of the JPA repository functions provided. Otherwise, thanks for watching the content, and see you in the next video where we implement the service layer. Thanks for watching, and see you there.